The First American Election. Part 1. The Birth of the Presidency. The story of how a brand new nation set out to choose its very first leader. In 1789, the United States faced a question it had never asked before. How do you choose a president when no one has ever been one? There were no parties, no campaigns, and no clear rules. Yet from that uncertainty came the basic framework of every American election that has followed. This is the story of how a brand new nation elected its first leader, and almost failed before it began. The first presidential election in the United States, held in 1789, was unlike the long, involved process that Americans know today. There were no official candidates, no campaign slogans, no rallies, and no political parties. There weren't even nominating conventions or primary elections. The whole process was brief, quiet, and centered on one great question: whether the new Constitution itself would endure. At that time, the country was still finding its identity. The idea of electing a president was completely new. Many Americans wonder why the first presidential election was not until 1789. Why not back in 1776, when independence was first declared? What had the nation been doing for those 13 years in between? The truth was, there had been no president at all during those years. When the colonies broke away from Britain, they didn't form a single, unified nation. Instead, they became 13 independent states, each its own small country, bound loosely together in a kind of alliance to fight the Revolutionary War. They worked together under a government called the Confederation Congress, but it wasn't really a federal government as people think of one today. Congress could make decisions, but it had no power to enforce them. If a state didn't want to follow an order or pay for something, it could simply ignore Congress. That loose structure caused serious problems, especially when it came to money and trade. Some leaders began to believe the states needed a stronger union, a national government that could actually function. So in 1787, delegates from most of the states met in Philadelphia. They gathered to fix the old Articles of Confederation, but instead, they wrote an entirely new plan: the Constitution of the United States. This new system changed everything. Under the old setup, the government had only one branch: the Confederation Congress. The new Constitution created three branches. Congress became the legislative branch, responsible for making laws, and it was split into two houses: the House of Representatives for the people and the Senate for the states. Then there was the executive branch, headed by a president who would enforce the laws. And finally, the judicial branch, led by a Supreme Court to interpret the laws. Once the Constitution was written, there was an important question to answer. How would this new nation choose its president? One option was to have Congress pick the president. That would have made the system more like a parliamentary government, where the legislature chooses its leader, like the government organization in Great Britain. But the men who wrote the Constitution, the framers, wanted to keep the executive and legislative branches separate. They rejected the idea of Congress choosing the president. Another option was to have the people vote directly for the president. Today, that sounds natural to most Americans, but the framers thought it would be impractical and risky. The country was huge and sparsely populated, communication was slow, and they worried that voters wouldn't know enough about candidates outside their own states. So the framers came up with a compromise: the Electoral College. It would be a temporary body of people chosen every 4 years just to select the president. This way, the process wouldn't mix the powers of Congress with the executive branch. Each state would decide for itself how to choose its electors. Some state legislatures would pick their electors directly. Other states would let the people vote for the electors. Once the electors were chosen, they would gather in each state capital and cast their votes for president. That system, with a few later changes, is still used in the United States today. When Americans go to the polls in November, they aren't technically voting for a presidential candidate. They're voting for electors who are pledged to a candidate. Those electors meet in December to cast the real votes that decide who becomes president. For the first presidential election, the Confederation Congress of the old government set the schedule and states chose their electors from December 15, 1788 to January 7, 1789. The electors would then meet on February 4th to choose the first president. 10 states took part. Rhode Island and North Carolina didn't participate because they hadn't yet approved the Constitution. In 5 states, Connecticut, Georgia, New Hampshire, New Jersey, and South Carolina, the legislatures chose the electors directly. In 3 states, Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, voters elected them. In 2 states, Massachusetts and Virginia, they used a mix of both systems. The New York legislature was deadlocked on how to choose its electors, and hadn't chosen any by January 7, 1789, and so, New York did not cast any votes in the first presidential election. Rhode Island and North Carolina had not ratified the Constitution, and did not participate. The biggest issue of that election wasn't about who should be president. Everyone knew George Washington would win, but about whether the Constitution itself was a good idea. Many Americans still doubted it. Some believed it betrayed the spirit of the Revolution, replacing the tyranny of a distant king with the tyranny of a distant Congress. Rural communities especially feared that a national government run by wealthy merchants and city leaders would ignore their needs. These tensions shaped the first election in American history, as citizens and lawmakers debated not just who should lead the nation, but whether the new system of government should exist at all. As the states struggled to accept this new system, old divisions re-emerged. Federalists and anti-Federalists clashed over power, the Constitution, and even whether the election should happen at all. The story of America's first election doesn't end here. In Part 2, the battle shifts to New York, where political deadlock, secret letters, and a last-minute compromise decide the fate of the nation's first presidency. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to be notified when Part 2, Conflict, Strategy, and the First Presidency is published.